Grandpa's Journal, Episode 6, An Exciting Prospect. The last Saturday of the month was to feature a harvest festival in town. There was to be a clam bake that Uncle Gus was looking forward to, horseshoe pitching contests, and a big barn dance. The whole family joined in and made a day of it. By the time the dance began late that evening, the old folks had just about had their fill of food, frolic, and foolishness. They'd had all the fun they could stand. They were full of clams and fritters and longed for home and hearth. Irving and Kathleen decided to stay for the square dancing, and the rest of the family was headed home. I was pretty tired myself, but I was desperate to try out my new boots on the dance floor. And as I turned hesitantly to follow my folks, I locked eyes with the prettiest little red-haired girl that I had ever seen. She and several other young ladies were eyeing me coyly from across the dance floor, and their combined effect was more than sufficient to impair the best judgment of any naive 10-year-old, new boots and all. After several minutes of protest, Mother succumbed to my pleadings and agreed to let me stay for the dance and come home later with Irving and Kathleen. The rest of the family headed home, and I bought a mug of cider and an ear of corn on the cob, and sat down on the edge of the loft, dangling my legs and grinning ear to ear. Enthusiastic doesn't begin to describe my state. I was exhilarated to the point of apoplexy. After finishing my refreshments, I licked my fingers, descended from the loft, and took my place alongside the other expectant onlookers in hopes of an opportunity to join in the fun. I didn't have long to wait. After a few minutes, the four young ladies whom I'd observed earlier began working their way around the floor, sizing up and critiquing the crowd of would-be dance partners. One by one, they would scrutinize the humiliated observers and point out their shortcomings, much as though they were comparing plucked poultry on market day. "What about this one would ask, and the others would offer criticisms. Too short, too thin, too eager. The most vocal and unquestioned leader of the pack was, of course, the little red-haired girl. She had the reddest hair, the thickest freckles, and the most luxurious get-along that I had ever seen. And as she approached, I held my breath and felt for all the world like the black sheep in a lamb judging contest. With the rest of the pack following closely and grinning with anticipation, the little red-haired girl stepped up boldly, looked me over briefly, and then stared intently into my face. I stared at my feet for a moment, bracing for rejection and humiliation, and then swallowed hard and returned her gaze. "Dance?" she asked enthusiastically, and then offered a soft, thin, freckled hand. My head was swimming, my heart pounded, and I was dangerously lightheaded from holding my breath. I grabbed her hand, and we took our place in a newly formed square, bowed to our partner, and the fiddle began to play. That little red-headed temptress whizzed tirelessly and elegantly around the room, frock flying and pigtails trailing, and I galloped happily at her side like a gangly pup, thoroughly enraptured in a state of perfect bliss. We'd allemande right and allemande left and do-si-do around that barn for the better part of an hour, and all at once I became aware that my poor feet were throbbing madly in those new boots, and several of my toes were clearly in tremendous distress. Just then the little red-haired girl turned hard to starboard, and we promenaded through the back door of that old barn and out into the dark emptiness of the dimly moonlit corral beyond. 1,000 breathtaking possibilities flooded my mind and weakened both my knees. And then, as I wrapped my arms around that warm, moist, gingham-clad form, and her sweet, cider-scented breath filled my nostrils, a milking stool came down on my head, and the darkness took me in and swallowed me up. Moments later, the cool, wet evening air rushed back into my lungs, the foul taste of barnyard dirt filled my mouth, and a vaguely familiar voice inquired, "Is that you, Mr. Camp?" It was Lige Timothy Kinney III. Well, I'm not certain of anything right at the moment, I said. I believe it's me. Are you all right? Well, the back of my head is leaking some, but I don't think nothing's busted. I don't know about that, said Lige with a grimace. This milking stool is ruined. Lige helped me to my feet and picked a piece of straw from my hair. Do you remember me? He inquired. You bet. You're Lige Timothy Kinney III. He flashed a big grin and stared at the ground in embarrassment. You can call me Lige, he said. Sure enough, I responded. Call me Obie. Well, Lige, did you happen to see what happened before the lights went out? Yes, sir. I was over yonder seeing a man about a horse when you and Maggie May come waltzing out. So I just sat there quiet like to see what would happen next. Next thing you know, Maggie's brother Teddy sneaks out of the shadows with that milking stool and raises this big old knot on your noggin. Then the two of them start rummaging through your pockets. Did they get your billfold, he asked. I don't have pockets or billfold, I answered. Did they take anything? I don't think so. I spent my last nickel on a roasting ear and a cup of cider. Except for the skull fracture, I'm just as they found me. Well then, says Lige, we'll just consider this whole affair an unfortunate imposition. We cleaned me up and brushed me off, and Lige put his hand on my shoulder. How about another apple cider to wash down that mouthful of dirt? Inquired Lige. Sounds good to me, I said. This whole affair has left a bad taste in my mouth. Do you know those two? Yeah, said Lige disgustedly. I know 'em. That was Maggie May O'Mara and her pesky brother Ted. They live just down the hill from us. They're always into something. She is pretty, though, said Lige, grinning and eyeing me expectantly. Pretty ornery, I replied. We finished our cider and reported back to Irving and Kathleen, who were getting ready to leave. Are you here by yourself? I asked Lige. Yep, I walked here with some other kids from the neighborhood, but I figure they're long gone. Lige readily accepted my offer of a ride home, and the four of us headed for the buckboard. Once in the buckboard, Irving hollered, "Giddy up," and the mule headed out at a leisurely pace. Lige and I sat dangling our legs on the tailgate and laughing till our sides ached about my short-lived love affair with little Maggie May. As we approached the turnoff to the Irish community, Lige pointed to a dilapidated old frame building with a broken window and a badly leaning steeple. You see that dandy cathedral over yonder? That's our church. Have you got plans for tomorrow? Just church, I said. Why don't you come to church with my family and me, asked Lige, and then spend the afternoon? His sudden invitation caught me a little unprepared. I'd attended Catholic churches all my life, and although I held no animosity toward the Protestant faith, I'd never actually entertained any thoughts of attending Sunday worship with a good Baptist. As I pondered the possibilities, my first inclination was to politely decline. My mother's response would be less than pleasant, and Dad would almost certainly have a stroke. Then I remembered Lige's sisters. I'd thought about Mariah often since our brief encounter in the Kinney's kitchen. I'd gone over the events of our meeting in my head until her memory was inherent in my heart. When I close my eyes at night, I see Mariah's. As the buckboard pulled up at the Kinney place, Lige slid to the ground, looked at me inquiringly, and asked, "See you tomorrow?" "I'll see you in church," I said, waving broadly at my new friend, and the mule broke into a dog trot as we headed out for home. A single candle flickered in the window as we pulled up at Camp House, but I breathed a huge sigh of relief as we entered the room and found everyone sound asleep. There would surely be consequences for returning so late from the festival, and a family discussion of tomorrow's church plans was better left until I was rested and better rehearsed. As I entered my room, a fairydiddle eyed me cautiously for a moment and then returned to licking his tiny pink paws and smoothing his prodigious whiskers. Christoph was snoring peacefully in his bunk, and the last remaining embers from the evening's fire cast a hospitable glow across the room. I eased slowly into the oak rocker by the stove, hoping to avoid waking my brother with the chair's characteristic squeak, and then gazed out the window at a familiar harvest moon. My first month on this strange new shore had been memorable and productive. I'd already been blessed with a comfortable new home and a remarkable new family, and today's adventures had secured one new friend and offered exciting prospects for another. My heart was light, my hopes high, and my spirits fairly soared.